Welcome back to a UWM student talking about the community of Milwaukee. Today I want to talk about Milwaukee Public Schools. Milwaukee, located in the southeast corner of the state, has undergone many changes geographically, economically, and socially within the community. It is not only relative to the Milwaukee, but the country in regard to education for all students. On the anniversary of Brown v. Board of Education, a study was conducted and showed Milwaukee has the highest number of segregated students compared to other cities in the country. There have been improvements, changes, progress towards the equality of education, but the causes of both racial and economic segregation are more complex than in 1954. Diversity is increasing in Milwaukee, and the changes need to continue in order for children to receive better education. For the change to happen in the community, members need to be aware of the disciplinaries happening. If people are able to act on the cause and the issue that is occurring, the information that is needed can be heard and can get spread around Milwaukee and other local cities. Jackson points to UWM article that said, of the 18 Milwaukee suburbs, 16 had radical convents. Not only is in the schools they are affected by segregation, but also far out in the community, even affecting parents or grandparents. Everything happens from something, and anyone can be affected by it. My question to you listeners is, how is Milwaukee schooling so much different than local cities? Some background information that I found about schools were money tends to sway many decisions in the country. Education is not different. One thing done in Milwaukee in the late 90s, early 2000s was the introduction of school vouchers. The Milwaukee Parental Choice Program, MPCP, was created in 1990 and is the country's first school choice voucher program. The program allows middle-income families who live in Milwaukee to enroll their children in private schools and that they couldn't afford otherwise. The use of education vouchers has been very beneficial in schools so far. They allow students with financial difficulties to receive funds in order to attend a private school. The reason for these vouchers was the ineffective teaching of Black and other minority students. Since the funding for urban school districts was lower and the numbers were higher, parents were fighting for some sort of solution. Although the thought for the voucher was created, it didn't solve any problems. The vouchers were very limited, meaning only some students were able to get them, and the journal noted that only 50 new private schools were created, and it didn't help all of the students still in the underfunding urban schools. The vouchers increasingly became a problem for funding and weren't something that solved the problem, but they became more of the problem, due to only a very few certain people being able to receive them and use them to benefit their education. It is clear when looking at funding reports and breakdowns for schools in Milwaukee that urban schools with higher rates of minority groups receive less funding. Part of the low funding is because of the urban communities. There's less money in the urban areas to dedicate to the schools, and the funding zones for schools and how much each one receives from the state and federal funding is also affected by that. Since these areas were mainly occupied by minority groups, and the pay for jobs has either gone down or their jobs have just been lost overall, and families are unable to move away to receive better schooling. After reading an article in 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed. This document included clear outlines for the exclusion, discrimination in places that receive federal money, clearly stating protects people from discrimination based on color, race, or national origin in programs or activities that receive federal financial assistance. It is also important to note that it defines how discrimination could be taking place. Administrations, recruitment, financial aid, academic programs, student treatment, counseling, guidance, discipline, classroom assignments, and even grading are just few examples that are brought up in literature today. Although the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, equal education has been ongoing issues. Programs and school districts changes have made since discrimination has been happening with the education for Black students. After reading a little bit more about it, I read some more about funding in schools, and recent discussion has been around increasing funding as being one of the best solutions to help increase test scores. It's not a matter of whether they need the funding, it's how the schools are going to get it. And a recent study shows that state testing, only 30% of Black students met the language arts score last year for their grade, and only 16% met the math grade. Some expressed concern that supporting funds towards a racial group would violate Rule 208, which says that there can be no action based on race. Instead, there has been a lower amount of funding going towards schools that have high poverty rate. Although this helps the schools in this category, it doesn't really help other schools low funding. So schools are still affected by the low funding on a daily basis, trying to figure out what they could do to benefit themselves and find the resources that they need during that time. A quote that I found was, in fall of 2008, enrollment in the main roster of schools in the Milwaukee public school system was 78,000, and in fall it was 58,000, which is a drop of 20,000 students in 14 years. During the first Joint Finance Committee meeting, lawmakers had a chance to hear from Wisconsin residents. Superintendents and other schools advocated increasing their spending caps and increasing the funding for special education and mental health professionals. Tony Evers did propose an increase to the budget of more than $2.6 billion for public schools, and people are hopeful that the budget for public schools will increase, as it is something that is much needed to help improve education for all students. In addition to the conference, Milwaukee education nonprofit City Forward Collection started a goal of adding 5,000 more seats in high-quality Milwaukee schools by 2025. And in order to make this happen, they started funding, and that has been the biggest issue. There were statistics shared that shows that 30% of Milwaukee students who were high-quality schools significantly exceeded the state report card. Overall, this has been one of the main arguments to get more students into these schools. During this time, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the segregation in schools. The desire for equal education has been around for decades, and it's really important to first see how the Milwaukee public school system was set up after the segregated schools were no longer. So first, they implemented a neighborhood attendance policy, which meant that children were going to schools that were closest to them. And since the housing in Milwaukee is segregated, it translated to the school system also being segregated. And teachers were another area where segregation took place. White teachers often taught white and black students, whereas black students only hired to teach black students. The number of black teachers was also severely low. In addition, Milwaukee Public Schools transfer policy allowed white students to transfer out of African American schools with little difficulty, whereas African American students faced challenges. With these implements in place, Milwaukee Public Schools was charged with intentional segregation. Eventually, there was no ration of students that must be met at Milwaukee Public Schools, but it didn't include any other private schools, since Milwaukee Public Schools were created to do this. Additionally, in 1976, the Chapter 2020 program was created to promote culture and racial integration in education. There was aid that was given to schools if students transferred between Milwaukee Public Schools and other suburban schools, if it would help improve racial balance. Overall, this really helped the school districts reach more than 20% minority. But unfortunately, the program is not having as much success today, and under the program, once the schools reach 30% minority of the school, does not receive any other money. So again, the program did not help to create some diversity in schools, but not continue to promote equal education. Before 1960s, a report showed that 72% of black students in Metro Milwaukee attended hyper-segregated schools, where students of color made up 905 of the students or more of the enrollment. Milwaukee ranks the worst out of the nation's largest 50 metro areas, and in 1987, only 21% of black students attended the schools. But the trend did not continue because it did not fully continue as well with the other factors. The newest data posted in 2019 showed that the percentage of black students attending hypersegregated schools to be 72.2%, showing Milwaukee having the highest rate of segregation. Programs have been put in place in order to create more diversity in the schools and stop the segregation in the school districts, and children have been moved either to schools that will receive very little funding or just to be a number to fill the quotas for minority groups. Then the children get teachers that are not trained or educated on different cultures and teachers who have no prior teaching ability. Ultimately, Milwaukee was created as a segregated city and is in fact one of the most segregated. To wrap everything up, black students did not receive the same education as other students because of the Milwaukee public school system was created. It was created based on location, and the location of neighbors in the community was built on segregation. Black families worked close to their homes, and jobs became less needed for black families, leaving them not able to move out of the community. Therefore, they were not able to move school districts either, and it does not end their program, and initiatives were created to help the diversity rates in school by providing benefits and money for students to move schools. This helped create more diversity in the schools, but it didn't really help with the students still at underserved schools. More funding is needed to help provide programs and improve the education system for all students. Since black students were transferred and moved to other schools, they are not seen as outcasts or not invited into schools. Now black students feel discriminated against in their schools and are suspended at mass rates compared to any other racial group. In conclusion, unequal education did not end with the Brown versus Board education or the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Rather, Milwaukee is segregated.